Good evening. This is Tim Ashe, President of the Vermont Senate. Thanks for joining me for one of my daily updates on Vermont's response to the COVID-19 crisis. I have a few things to talk about today. I'm going to briefly describe, though, yesterday one of the things that I described was the legislation we passed in the Senate yesterday, which is being taken up, I believe, as we speak in the House. And one of the things that was really important to us was that we carry out our business in the safest possible way. One of the things we did was encourage people who did not feel the need to be in Montpelier to stay at home, because the work we had done was intended to be completely consensus, meaning truly everybody in the Senate got behind it. We were very pleased that we were able to achieve that objective, so all the bills that we passed yesterday had 100% support. Actually, stage managing the safety was really critical, and I'll just say a quick word. We had a staging area on the first floor of the State House. For those of you who have not been there, the Senate and House chambers are on the second floor, and we made everyone sit spaced apart. We had a separate staging area for members of the media so that they were spaced out as well. We then had a seating chart so that people who attended the Senate action were all sitting spaced out enough that we were both keeping ourselves safe but also modeling the right behavior for others. We actually had this seating chart, which you can kind of see here, which had people sitting in seats that were not their own, people sitting in window wells, people sitting on couches, all very unusual. I've never watched members of the Senate vote from anywhere but their seats. But that's how seriously we were taking the safety issues and making sure people were properly distanced. So it was an unusual day, and I know that in the House today they're going through the exact same challenges, which I think they just passed a few minutes ago, hot off the presses. But they have 150 people, unlike our 30. So you can imagine trying to manage people so that they're all safely separated but able to vote. I'm going to just briefly say, one of the things about this last 2 weeks has been, I think, a collective recognition that some of the things we take for granted shouldn't be taken for granted. And this isn't Tim's show and tell here, but right before the crisis really developed, we had received, I don't know if this will show up, but I'll try and angle it, these types of notes from members of the community. It says, all Vermonters should share in Vermont's bounty. They were basically, and those are just the ones that came out. These are envelopes stacked full of them. These were people asking for expansion of food programs to take care of people who are food insecure, which is, I guess, the technocratic way of saying people who don't have a lot of money and struggle to put helpful food on the table. So, sometimes when groups come before the legislature, it can often seem like yet another interest group, yet another lobbyist with their hands out looking for more money out of the state budget. And earlier today, I spoke with about 30 directors, some of them paid, some of them volunteer, of food pantries and food shelves throughout Vermont. I was happy that the food bank was able to arrange the call with their members and recipients of their food from all around the state. So every corner of the state was on this call, and I asked them really just to tell me what they're experiencing on the ground. And it was a difficult hour of listening about the real hardship people are experiencing. The number of homebound meals being delivered out of what used to be the Chittenden Emergency Food Shelf went from 145 to 210 in just one day. You can imagine that made them have to adjust everything in their operations. In communities like Hardwick, 40% increase very, very quickly. Central Vermont, same thing. 100% increase in demand at the Shelburne Food Shelf. And the story was really the same all across the state. Most of these food shelves are running largely on volunteer support under normal circumstances. They get some donations, and they get some state support and food that's distributed through the food bank. And so one of the real challenges that they've been experiencing is not only making sure they have enough food, although that's not the primary problem at many of these places, it's having people who are able to be there and volunteer. If just one or two people feels like they might be at risk and don't show up, that can throw off the normal operations of a community food shelf. And so one of the things that I hope people will do is, if you're at home, if you're of an age that does not fall into the vulnerable category, contemplate calling the local food shelf and asking if they need volunteers. They don't want someone who's going to come just for 10 minutes, say they did it, and leave. They need someone who understands that they have to get some training so that they know how to properly manage the distribution of food. But it was very, very disheartening to hear that some food shelves around the state have closed, not because there's not need and not because there's not the food to distribute, but they can't safely distribute it. And to translate, that means in general they need people who will step up and help. Some of them do need cash support. I talked to one director of a food shelf. Her title is part-time. She said she's been putting in way more than full-time with no expectation that she's getting paid for it. So any support that people can offer, either in volunteer time or cash to our food shelves, will be really critical. And as I say, it is really puts in perspective what oftentimes seem like just requests to get a piece of the state budget pie. It tells us why we do those things in the first place. And the people who volunteer at food shelves often are people who are of retirement age, so in some cases they're the ones most nervous about being exposed to many people because of the potential for infection. So wanted to just give a shout out to those who do the work at food shelves throughout the state. It is incredibly difficult work under normal times because of what people often describe as compassion fatigue. You're really trying to help people, and with the stress that people are under now, it's getting much more serious. I want to talk a little bit about the executive order that was issued yesterday, which is called the stay-at-home order, this stay-at-home, stay-safe order that the governor issued. To simplify the information that we have learned, the governor's order is essentially saying that only business and other operations which are critical to provide services to vulnerable populations, to provide manufacturing, distribution, supply of certain core activities, whether it's medical supplies, pharmacy, food, community services like mental health, community health clinics, all of those things can stay open, but basically everything else is either closed or essentially ordered to be done remotely. I have received a number of communications since the governor's order yesterday. I had briefly walked through a number of the categories that were given exemptions from the stay-at-home order. Some of them are more clear than others. You know if you're in a hospital, but you don't know if your work site is critical to economic security, which is a much more vague term. People in the construction industry were questioning whether they fell under different categories. So what I can tell you now is that if you go to the Agency of Commerce website, you will see kind of a frequently asked questions or information for businesses under their COVID-19 page. There is a spreadsheet that has industries described one by one, and all the ones in green have effectively been told that they are to keep operating if they choose. All of the ones in red are being told you are not to keep your doors open unless you fill out a special form explaining why your workplace should continue to operate and can do so safely. So when you go to the Agency of Commerce website, you will see the industries roughly grouped. If you feel that your business or thing you do to make a living is in the red, meaning not allowed to operate, but you think it should be, you can submit a form on the Agency of Commerce website. So it's ACCD is the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and I can reply to comments after with a link to that so that you can seek relief, if you will, from this order. A couple of the more frequent industries that asked me if they were able to keep operating were construction. And by that I mean housing, construction, home builders, carpenters, painters, and things like that. The short story is that the governor's order with the new clarification says that those are to close, meaning tomorrow job sites around the state will be shuttered. If a particular contractor or builder believes that they should be able to keep working, they should go to the Commerce site and fill out the document that allows you to make the case for staying open. There's a team of 15 people at the Agency of Commerce who are working on reviewing those and making a case-by-case decision. Obviously, they're getting flooded with hundreds of these types of requests. Other questions I got about who would be open. One, medical marijuana dispensaries, in fact, will stay open, are able to stay open because they fall into something akin to the pharmacy exemption. Another is hotels that are open because they're serving people who are helping meet the crisis or helping a state agency house people who might need to be in isolation. So that one we also learned in a conversation today that they are allowed to stay open. Someone has just posted the site, so I encourage you to go to Meg's posted comment where you will see the spreadsheet and additional information. There are some people who have asked me, well, I've got 3 people on my contractor team. We're outside, we're separated by 100 feet at a given time. Why wouldn't we be able to operate? And I am not here to, I did not make the decision, but let me say what the Secretary of Commerce said. Her first statement, and this is one I think we all do rally behind, was ultimately we're trying to save people's lives first. That is the top priority here with all the decisions. And then second, she said, it may very well be that some people should be able to keep operating, but they want you to fill out that form. So want to encourage anyone who is worried or not sure whether they're supposed to go to work tomorrow or whether they, if they're the manager of an operation, are supposed to go, would encourage you to go to the Agency of Commerce website. I'm going to offer a brief bit of good news, if there's good news at this moment. And it seems like it's hard to say anything is good news right now, but I received a call with a Washington, D.C. number a little bit earlier today, which is not typical for my legislative work since everybody's in 802, and it was Senator Leahy. I had mentioned in a previous call that Speaker Johnson and I had talked with Senator Leahy maybe 3 or 4 days ago to give him a sense of what we believed was strongly needed in Vermont to help us get through this crisis, both in the healthcare setting but also financially. The number that we believe is likely to come to Vermont, this is not a situation where we reduce everything to dollars. Human lives and dollars are different things. But in terms of the financial hit we've taken and how many dollars we might have to help get out of this, Senator Leahy suggested that the amount, and I look at this number, it's hard to say it out loud, $1.25 billion. I feel like I'm in Austin Powers. And then there would be additional amounts on top of that for certain discrete programs that are in some of the federal legislation. So I've talked about hundreds of millions of dollars of shortfalls that we can expect in the coming months alone, let alone what we might see as an impact for the next fiscal year, which starts in July. But it does look like the federal bill that's working its way through the U.S. Senate today before it gets to the House in the next couple days will be about $1.25 billion. Where will that money go is a very reasonable question. We will learn a lot between now and Friday. Among the uses we think will be available, about $50 million to Vermont or so, and this number will go up or down, but it's a big number, to support transit. If any of you have seen a Green Mountain Transit bus moving around, they're helping get many people who are doing critical jobs from place to place, so they've had to keep running, although they've cut back their service. On the other hand, it often looks like single occupancy vehicles with just the driver because there's not a lot of people going from place to place. So they still need to pay their bills. They are a public entity, and the resources don't materialize out of thin air. So the federal government is going to be sending a substantial amount of money to Vermont for that. 60 million or so, we think, for schools. One of the big worries we have right now is that with the substantial reduction in sales and use, rooms and meals, and purchase and use, which is for vehicle purchases, we are very worried about our ability to fund the school budgets, which have been substantially passed by the voters back on town meeting day. So we think it's about 60 million for schools. Like with everything that comes from Washington, it likely has specific parameters around it, probably to keep our operations level and avoid cuts. That's the approach Washington took during the Great Recession, which was sadly my first couple years in the Senate, which was felt like this all the time as well. 300 million for state and local governments. We have substantial costs being borne right now by everything from police departments with overtime because they're stretched thin, fire departments, EMS. At the state level, there's no shortage of areas where we're spending money at a more rapid clip than normal. Everything from mental health services to hospital services, plus we're going to need to meet so many other needs in terms of economic development and everything else. So 300 million, how that gets divided by state and local governments is yet to be seen, but a big number. 260 million for hospitals. And I can't say enough. Normally, I don't spend my time apologizing for the most well-funded hospitals, but all of our hospitals are under financial constraints, some of them in desperate straits right now, including at some facilities where executives have been taking pay cuts and to help get through these moments. So $260 million minimum for hospitals to support us is a really critical step forward. So a grand total, we think, of about $1.25 billion. One of the other important things, and this is critical to many of the people out there who have been laid off or have chosen to stay home but are eligible under the recent federal rules, there is going to be what is described as dramatically expanded unemployment compensation. So we'll see what that means. My suspicion is it will give more wage replacement under unemployment benefits. It might also allow more people to have access to it. I know that there are still people asking, what about independent contractors and sole proprietors? We are going to have to sift through the legislation that is being worked through Congress right now to see how it helps small business owners, independent contractors, sole proprietors. I also know that in conversations with the governor's team, Senator Michael Sorokin, who's the chair of the Economic Development Committee, and others, for many businesses, the idea of a new loan of 3.75% interest, which is the Small Business Association Disaster Assistance, or another loan, just doesn't even resonate because you can't take on more debt. So we are mindful of that. We are going to do what we can to figure out how to get to the other side of this and have as many of the small businesses come back and be on the same footing as when this whole thing started. I did have one person ask me to talk a little bit about who is supposed to get tested. So I just want to say a quick word. This is more informational. I think before the coronavirus came to our shores, there's a general sense that we have plans in place for what happens in a pandemic flu. But now, of course, we're seeing nationwide that the capacity to test and do everything else are not adequate. So I read this. This is the guidance from the health department, which is now being implemented in partnership with UVM Medical Center and other providers. But I do think it is important that I'm just going to read it so it's kind of can register. Under their guidance, under which patients should be tested, and this has gone out to every medical doctor in the state of Vermont through the Vermont Medical Society. It says most people with mild symptoms of COVID-19 can be managed at home without testing, much as providers can empirically manage patients who might have the flu. The health department advises against testing most people with mild fever or respiratory symptoms because, and then it has 3 bullets of why they don't recommend those people being tested. The first, and I'll paraphrase, is because if you show up, you might actually infect the medical providers who you're there to see. So if your symptoms aren't severe symptoms, it's saying do not send the person in for testing because they might actually spread the illness to even more people. 2, and this gets to the national unpreparedness or shortages that we've been hearing about in the news nationally and in Vermont. It says we must preserve our limited personal protective equipment and supplies for the system to care for patients who will be developing the more severe forms of the illness in the coming months. So it's really managing supplies so the people who need it the most desperately, it's available for them. And then it says confirming infection for every person does not change how most people's illness is managed. Now this might be cold comfort for some people who will want to know. What the health department is saying is that if you have very mild symptoms and you test positive, you're going to be told to go home and stay there for a period of time, just like you would be told to go home and stay there for a period of time if you just told your doctor about the symptoms you had but hadn't been tested. So the health department and the medical community have effectively become the unhappy gatekeepers of these testing resources and supplies. And I just thought it would be helpful for people to understand how it is that the testing program is being triaged, if you will, and ask that when you're speaking to a doctor, understand that they're following the same guidance and protocols. If you have more serious symptoms, it's a different story, and they will get you in for testing. And in a previous video, I explained how they're prioritizing testing and getting results back as fast as possible. So for those of you who have wondered why not everyone gets a test if they show symptoms, that is the short story, and I know that it's not easy sometimes to hear that only certain people will get the resources, but that's the state of affairs until the federal government provides way more testing resources. I think that's the status quo for now. One of the people commenting is asking if it's still recommended that people call their primary care physicians if they exhibit mild symptoms, and I would say the answer is yes. Many people will maybe suspect they have the symptoms but might not know fully what it looks and feels like to have COVID-19, and so by calling your primary care physician, they can walk through some guidance to give a better indication that you might be able to than you might be able to give for yourself. So at this point, I'm going to wrap for the day and say that we are girding ourselves for some tough days ahead. As I've said before, the fact that our National Guard is helping construct 3 overflow hospital-like facilities, including at Gutterson Fieldhouse at UVM, one up in St. Albans, and I'm spacing on the third one. That just says how much work's being done to create what's called surge capacity, so that if our hospital beds are full, people have somewhere else that's sanitary to go. And but that is something that we're used to seeing in movies, not seeing in our own lives. It just goes to show how serious we're taking it. And you know, it's really been a pretty sobering few weeks to understand that things that I think many Americans believe only happen in other countries, whether it's, you know, mostly we think of like third world countries, or we think about some apocalyptic movie. And I think what is happening now in this global society we live in is a wake-up call for all of us that these things can happen here. And I mentioned a little bit about how the food shelves feel inundated right now, some of them having to close because they don't have the volunteers or staff who can safely distribute it. And I hope that when we get to the other side of this, and we will, we will all take a step back and really recalibrate what we believe are valuable activities in our society. I have found that most of the people who are enduring some of the most difficult days trying to meet people's needs are the ones that our society pays the absolute least. They're the people whose jobs are considered just a short-term thing, maybe a young kid does, or something that's more like a volunteer thing. And now we're in a crisis, and people say, we need these people. Where are they? Why aren't they willing to go above and beyond? And let me just put it in perspective. Our mental health system, I'm sorry to go off on a soapbox, our mental health system for many years was depleted, had its resources depleted. In recent years, the legislature has started to try to rebuild and reinvest in the workforce. But put this thought in your mind. We have residential settings where some people with certain mental health challenges reside that require full-time staffing, meaning that you might have someone there for 3 different 8-hour shifts over the course of the day or overlapping. Those jobs in recent years have paid as little as $12 or $13 an hour. Imagine putting yourself in the shoes of possibly being in a situation that might be dangerous physically, that would be absolutely mentally taxing, emotionally taxing, and our society has paid jobs like that $12, $13 an hour year after year after year. Well, right now, it's the wake-up call. When we need them the most, if that person doesn't show up for work, we'll all know how important their work is. And the question when we get to the other side of this is, are we willing to reward that kind of work for the critical, vital profession it is? We are calling it essential workers as an exemption from a stay-at-home order right now. The question is, will we call them essential workers when this crisis is over and when the state of emergency is over? And I really hope that we will. We owe so much to these people right now, and I hope we'll mark down all the people whose work right now you think is indispensable. And then after this is all over, we'll look at how much those people get paid every year, and then we'll have another discussion, I think. So now I'm off my soapbox. Thank you so much for tuning in. Keep your questions coming. As I say, I'll keep doing this as long as the information I'm offering is helpful. It does look like federal support is on the way, which is a real blessing for our state. And so with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you, and I hope everyone stays safe.